Hello ladies and gentlemen, my name is Mings, and today I'm doing a video which I think a lot of you guys saw coming. First I did a video about what I wanted from a Path of Radiance remake, and then I did a video about what I wanted from a Genealogy remake, and today we are concluding the trilogy by talking about what I want from a Binding Blade remake. And the answer is fairly simple. Binding Blade is already a perfect game, so it doesn't need a remake. Anyway, thank you guys for watching, give a like and a comment. Okay, I'm just joking. Okay, so as you all know, Binding Blade is my favorite game in the series. And so a remake of Binding Blade would be something that I would be very anxious about. Excited for sure, but also very anxious, because of course I would be worried about them screwing up my favorite Fire Emblem game. Now, a lot of people are wondering, Mengs, why do you like Binding Blade so much? Well, I made an entire video on it, link in the video description if you want to go check it out. But to quickly summarize it, it's a good dose of nostalgia, and I do realize that. I played Binding Blade at a point where I thought there were no other Fire Emblem games around, and so I was very happy when I discovered it. I didn't realize how to patch it at first because it was in Japanese, and when I finally got around to learning how to do it, I was very excited, and it felt like I had unlocked a secret chest of goodies, which is probably why I had such an insane first impression of Fire Emblem 6, because it just did an impression on me emotionally. Now, I like a lot of the convoluted, clunky game mechanics of FE6. I feel like a lot of its design, while maybe a bit annoying to some people, give it a lot of charm. It's the perfect mix of good and old, and new and exciting to me. Like, it still has many of the modern things in Fire Emblem that I really like, while at the same time, it keeps some of those old, outdated elements from old series that I find extremely endearing, and I'll get more into that as the video progresses. But without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, let's talk about what I would want from a Binding Blade remake. Let's begin. So, as always, I'm going to be starting off this video in the similar style to the two other ones I did, by talking about the game's engine, what I want it to look like. And I know I'm going to sound like a broken record here, but I really don't want them to change much. I think that the way FE6 looks is really great, because it's from the Game Boy Advance era of Fire Emblem, and the GBA era of Fire Emblem is the Golden Age of Fire Emblem. And I think that's probably because of the animations. The animations are just timeless. I mean, particularly the crits. Who can ever forget the heroes throwing their shields up into the air before they attack? Like, stuff like that will always stick with me, and I think that always makes a big impression on players playing these games for the first time. The crits, and particularly the battle animations, are so good looking. I mean, I don't think they ever managed to go back to this quality of animations. None of the games since have been able to pull off this level of detail and this level of epicness in their animations. And so, if they remake FE6, I want it to look like FE6. I want it to look better, upscaled, you know, more smooth flowing. I want it to have a higher resolution, obviously, but I want those GBA animations to be in. I want them to look exactly the same, just better. I know this is what I've said about the two previous ones too, but this is just what I think about it. So I'm not going to spend any more time on this topic. Let's move on to the next one. So up next, I want to talk about the game's story. Should it be changed in any way? Should it be expanded upon? What should they do about it to make it more appealing? Because a lot of people criticize FE6 for having a pretty bland story, and I do see where people are coming from. Roy is not a very exciting protagonist, and I think one of the biggest problems about Roy, other than the fact that in FE6 he doesn't really have facial expressions, which is the thing that makes him appear very bland. You never get to see him angry or sad or anything like that, and that could easily be changed in a remake to make him more appealing, but I think Roy's biggest problem is the fact that he doesn't really have any good characters to bounce off on in dialogue. He only really talks to Merlinus, and Merlinus is very boring in FE6. And he also talks a lot with Guinevere, and Guinevere isn't exactly, you know, the picture of excitement either. So I think adding a couple of extra side characters for Roy to converse with would work, but they could also just try to make Roy more appealing. I think voice acting would do a lot for this. Voice acting and facial expressions would really improve Roy's character a ton. But I will say that I actually think FE6's story does something that a lot of modern Fire Emblem games, and games in general, don't really do these days, and that is focusing on its world. And FE6 is a very world-based story. It focuses a lot on the continents, the history behind the continents, the lore behind the continents, and not so much on character interactions. And I think that this is a lost art in video games. I think more video games should focus on their world as opposed to their characters. FE7, by contrast, is a game that almost never focuses on its world, but just on the character interactions. Of course, it has the benefit of having 3 main characters, which means they always have someone to talk to, as opposed to Roy, who can only really talk to the side characters, because of course everyone else can be dead in the story at any time, so they can't really include them as much. So I think that FE6 story, sure, you can make it a bit more character-oriented. They're probably going to do that. But I really wouldn't want them to change that much about it. I still think they should focus on the world, they should focus on the culture of each nations, the politics between the nations. I think this is one of the reasons that FE6 is unique and stands out in the story. Because it's not focused on Roy and his emotions and his feelings all the time. If you delve into his supports, there's quite a lot of talk about that, but in the main story, Roy doesn't really make it about himself. And that's kind of why I like him. I mean, I just called him bland, and yes, I'm not saying he's exciting, but I like Roy as a protagonist. I feel like he fills the role really well. The game doesn't really focus on him as being the chosen one, or how he views things, or how he feels in the moment. Roy's kind of just the commander, trying to get his army to win. And I think that's how you should tell a story about medieval war times. Because, like, who cares about Roy's feelings of the matter, right? Like, that shouldn't be in focus. But I get that in order to appeal to a younger audience who tend to relate more to emotions and character interactions, you kind of have to include more of this stuff. But I would honestly like it if we just expanded more on the world of Alib, its politics, its stories, its people. That's what I like in a video game. I know I'm in the minority, but again, this is a video called What I Want from a Binding Blade remake, not what you want, so yeah. So up next, I'm going to talk about probably one of the most controversial topics in this video. I'm assuming this is what most of the comments in the comment section will be talking about, and that is FE7's inclusion in an FE6 remake. Should we alter an FE6 remake so that FE7 makes more sense? And maybe the most controversial topic of all, should there be FE7 characters showing up in an FE6 remake? Should we have Lyn as a playable character? Oh boy, all the Lyn fanboys are gonna come out in force on this one, but my answer to that is a resounding no. I do not want to see playable Lyn in FE6.
Why, you little maggot! You make me want to vomit!
She can show up as a side character, I wouldn't mind that. Let's say you go to Sakai, and after you liberate Bolgar or whatever, I wouldn't mind Lyn showing up in a cutscene. I think she'd be 38 years old. Yeah, because Lyn is 18 in FE7, and FE6 takes place 20 years after FE7, so she'd be 38 years old. So she could still look good. She could be like Mama Lyn. People would like that, I'm sure. But she could show up in a cutscene, talk to Roy, and go like, "Thank you for liberating Sakai. I really appreciate it. How is Eliwood doing, by the way?" And Roy can be like, "Yeah, he's kind of sick, but he's still alive." And then she asks for Hector, and then of course Roy tells her that Hector's dead, and she might be a little bit sad about that. And honestly, I think this would be completely fine. Like, her showing up in a cutscene, I wouldn't mind that at all. What I don't want is pre-promoted nomadic trooper Lyn joining the battlefield. No. No, 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 no. I don't want that at all. This is Roy's story. This is the story of Roy and his companions, and I do not want FE7 characters showing up stealing the spotlight. What I could actually see them doing, and what would absolutely infuriate me, by the way, would be if Lyn took the spot of Dion, for example. Instead of Dion showing up, it's like, it's Lyn fighting the guerrilla war for Sakai. I would not like this at all. And this is not about me bashing Lyn or anything like that. I would have the same opinion of, for example, Pent or Louise showing up as playable characters. Again, I wouldn't mind them showing up in a cutscene. I wouldn't mind them being referenced. I wouldn't mind them having some minor role in the story. But if Louise shows up as like a super high pre-promoted sniper and kind of like outshines other characters like Igran, I wouldn't like that. I wouldn't like that. I feel like that would be corny. Maybe it's just the old school elitist in me coming forward right here, but again, I feel like FE6 should be focused on FE6's characters, and FE7 characters showing up would hog a lot of their spotlight, and it would feel kind of convoluted and weird. And I'm not a big fan of this retconning where you go back and you change certain aspects to, you know, accommodate a future game that wasn't even out by the time FE6 came out. But again, they could do little cameos, they could do little spotlights of the previous characters, they could be referenced, but I don't want them as playable characters. Maybe like one or two small ones, maybe, as Easter egg characters. Like, would I want Carla to show up, for example? Oh wait, no, she's dead. That's a bad example. Oh god. Anyway, there's one more thing I want to touch upon in regards to this topic before I move on, and that is whether or not characters like Eliwood and Hector should have their role in the story expanded. And of course, in FE6, Hector and Eliwood are hardly present at all, because they're just supposed to be minor side characters. But due to their inclusion in FE7 as main characters, they're obviously a lot more popular in the community, and so should we take that into account when remaking FE6. Now, in terms of Eliwood, I actually wouldn't be terribly upset if he makes a bit of a cameo as a playable character. Eliwood does actually survive for the entirety of FE6's story. He's sick at the start of it, but he's still alive when Roy comes home. It is implied that he dies shortly after the war, but he could still technically be around. Like, if he shows up as a playable pre-promoted paladin in the late game, I wouldn't necessarily jump with joy, but I wouldn't terribly mind it either. Like, Eliwood is a character that definitely could have a bit of more of an impact on the story. I wouldn't mind him being a little bit involved in the politics of everything that goes on, for example. But with Hector, he kind of just dies at the start of the game, and you can't really have it any other way. If Hector survives in an FE6 remake, I'm not going to like it, because of course, Hector's death is what sets in motion a lot of the events that takes place in Ostia, for example. The entire Ostian rebellion takes place because Hector dies. If Hector survives, that doesn't make any sense anymore. So, while I could definitely see them doing something silly, like they find Hector in the dungeons, they think he's going to die, and then he shows up later and is like, I somehow survived because I am tough, haha. That to me would be a bit cheap, because again, Hector's death is pretty integral for a lot of the game's plot, and also I kind of like, you know, the whole Armads thing where Durbans, when Hector picks up the Armads, he tells Hector that he's going to die on the battlefield. He's not going to die in his bed, he's going to die a violent death, and that's exactly what happens in FE6, and I feel like that bit of continuity should probably stay in place. Now, Hector could probably have more dialogue, maybe he'll talk more to Roy or whatnot, maybe we'll see him maybe in a cutscene prior to his death. I wouldn't necessarily mind that, but as for Hector's role in the story, he kind of has to die early on for the plot to make sense, and I wouldn't want them to change that at all. Now, in terms of other characters, like, should they mention Nurgle, for example? Should they drop a line about him? Should they talk about the Black Fang when they're in Burn? No, I don't think they should, honestly. They could, I wouldn't mind if they referenced it, but I feel like the less they include FE7 and FE6 plot, the better, honestly. Like, it's fan service, and I get it. They probably want to please the FE7 fan base, but I feel like you do it too much and it just becomes cheap. So up next, I want to talk about balance. This is something that a lot of people talk about when they play FE6, the fact that the game feels a little bit clunky and outdated. And I think a big part of why FE6 feels very clunky to some people is the fact that it's just very hard. And when I say hard, the difficulty of FE6 isn't high because of its genius enemy placement or anything like that, similar to what Conquest does, but just due to the fact that your player units are kind of weak and the enemies are very strong. They have a luck stat, which makes them a lot more dodgy, and then you have the weapon hit rates, which are also pretty low across the board. So in FE6, it's very common for your playable characters to have around 60 to 70% hit on enemies, and that just results in a lot of misses. Even with the 2RN system, which was included to make this less tedious, you still see a lot of misses in that game, at least compared to some of the newer games in the series. And I do get why people don't like that. I really do. It's annoying. And I definitely wouldn't mind them changing that. There's a lot of things I don't want them to change about FE6, but this is not one of them. I think that you could definitely up the hit rates of lances and axes, you could definitely reduce the luck stat of enemies, and you could improve some of the stats on your own playable characters. I'm going to talk more about weak playable characters in the next segment, but again, just to summarize, I don't mind them making FE6 feel a little bit less clunky. I think there's ways you can keep the difficulty in and still make it a hard Fire Emblem game without necessarily having to make the player go through a bunch of 60 to 70% hit rates, because that is just frustrating. That results in a lot of resets, and it's not necessarily fun. So definitely you could change this aspect of the game, and I wouldn't be upset about it. So up next, I want to talk about all the weak playable characters in FE6, and there are a lot of them. I mean, this game has a massive roster of units, and yet so many of them are so painfully mediocre. Units like Trek and Noah, for example. I mean, they're Cavaliers, and Cavaliers are great. We all like Cavaliers, right? And they become Paladins, which are even greater, but yet I've tried using them in both of my Iron Man runs, and despite supporting them up with each other, they just never amount to much. They're just painfully average. And there's so many Treks and Noahs in FE6, so many characters that on the surface they seem like okay units, but whenever you give them an actual spin, they very rarely amount to anything beyond average. Now, I'm very torn on this issue. on one side, this is one of the things I like about FE6. This is one of the things that makes FE6 feel very unique to me. The fact that not everyone is good. Not everyone is good. Someone is just average, and they're just regular people. They're not these superhumans that can solo armies like Rutger and Percival. And because they're average, it makes the other characters that are actually good stand out more. And I know realism in Fire Emblem is not a convincing argument for the most part, but it does make the world seem a bit more realistic, you know, the fact that there's these playable characters who are just not particularly strong. And I think if you change that, if you go the Project Ember route and you buff every playable unit, you make everyone feel less special. And that's exactly what happened in my Project Ember playthrough. In case you guys don't know, in case you clicked on this video and you haven't watched much of my previous content, that's a remaster of FE6 done by some other people. You know, and I guess you could call it like an unofficial remake. And what happened in Project Ember was exactly what I predicted would happen. That's the fact that when everyone's special, when everyone feels special, when everyone has personal weapons and improved stats, no one feels special. In fact, the game mostly became a Roy solo fest, which is exactly what you don't want in FE6. So yeah, you don't want to go the Project Ember route and just buff everyone. But I would be okay with them buffing someone a little bit. There are some characters in FE6 who just, they will never be used unless you specifically go in with the intention of using them. And I do agree that, you know, characters like Bartra, for example, as much as I love the guy, a couple extra points of speed would do a lot for him, you know, at least so he doesn't get doubled by tier 1 units. You know, that'd be kind of cool. You know, units like, for example, Trachanoa, which I just talked about, you know, it would be good if their growths were upped a little bit so that they can actually keep up with the rest of your army. You know, units like Geese, who joins in the Western Isles, who just is painfully average. Just a couple of buffs to his bases would do a lot for him, you know? So, again, you really gotta show restraint on this, because if you go the Project Ember route, you end up making no one feel special. But at the same time, there are some characters which do need a little bit of help, so you would need to be extremely careful and buff some characters a little bit, and I think that's how I would want it to be in an FE6 remake. But I still would want there to be power disparity between the characters, because again, that is what makes some of the characters feel unique. And also, if you do not have weak characters in your game, you have very little meme potential. I mean, just remember how epic it was when Volt turned into one of my best units in my FE6 Iron Man run. That wouldn't have happened if Volt weren't otherwise bad, you know? When you have bad characters in Fire Emblem, you create more opportunities for great stories. And that's important, I think. We gotta have that. So, yeah, that's what I want. Bad units, but also not many as bad units. So up next, I want to briefly talk about the game's difficulty, how hard it should be. I touched upon this briefly during the balance segment, but I want to talk a little bit more about it. So in the original Fire Emblem 6, you had normal mode and you had hard mode. And I think over the years, FE6 has kind of earned a wrongful reputation as being this insanely hard elite Fire Emblem game. It certainly is difficult compared to a game like Sacred Stones, but I don't really think it holds up to even Conquest on hard mode, honestly. Yes, FE6's hard mode is very front-loaded in its difficulty. There are really strong enemies in the early game and your playable units aren't that strong, although you got units like Marcus to carry you through it, so it's not really that big a deal. But I will say that I think people are very afraid of FE6's hard mode just because of that early game. But the truth is, it's not really that dangerous once you reach the mid to late game. Your enemies don't really hold up to your playables, in my opinion. But I will say that in a potential remake, I wouldn't mind them adding like more difficulties. Like I wouldn't mind them adding easy, normal, hard, and lunatic, for example. I always feel like this is something most Fire Emblem games don't do often enough. There's not enough variety in difficulties. And I wouldn't even be terribly sad if they added Casual Classic. Like, I'm okay with it at this point. I used to hate it, but I understand that adding a casual mode makes more players willing to try the game. I understand permadeath is something that frightens a lot of people, so sure, add it in. I don't want a turn wheel. I really don't want a turn wheel. I hope, sincerely hope that they don't add a turn wheel mechanic to an FE6 remake, although I feel like it's probably one of those mechanics that have just come to stay at this point, and they're probably not going to take it out. But yeah, if you have casual, why do you need a turn wheel? I don't get this. I really don't. It's kind of weird to me. But hey, it is what it is, I guess. But still, I will say that in terms of difficulty, I feel like the early game on hard mode definitely should be tuned down a little bit. But I honestly wouldn't mind if it got a little bit harder towards the end game. Because, again, That is a curse with most Fire Emblem games. They tend to be front-loaded difficulty-wise, and then towards the late game they stop being difficult. Conquest is one of the few games that was able to turn this around a little bit, and that game actually feels like it gets progressively harder towards the end game, which is really good design. So I would like something like that for FE6. So up next, I want to talk about the secret ending, or I guess as some people call it, the good ending and the bad ending. So in FE6, you go around collecting legendary items, and if you don't get all the legendary items by the time you fight Sephiel, you don't get the good ending. The game ends right there and then. They all go home thinking they've dealt with the true threat, but the true threat is still out there. It's kind of implied that everyone dies, which is kind of sad. But if you get all the legendaries, after you kill Sephiel, they light up, you go to the Dragon Temple, you fight the real threats. And this is both good and bad design at the same time. On one side, I really like it. On another one, I really hate it. When I first beat FE6 for the first time, I did not get the good ending. I beat Sephiel and the game ended, and you got the weird, like, short character endings, which doesn't really go into depth. And I remember just feeling really hollow about it. I was like, is this the way FE6 ends? Really? What happened to that Dark Priestess? What happened to that Dragon General we didn't see? I just remember feeling like this game was incomplete. And I mean, for the most part, it was, because I didn't get the good ending, right? And I even played FE6 a second time, and I still didn't get the good ending. And I just remember feeling even worse about it on my second time beating it. I was like, I must have missed something. And then I randomly saw a YouTube video of Roy fighting Idun, and I was just like, what? I don't remember that boss. How did you? And I just remember asking in the comments, like, how did you do that? And then I randomly made my way onto a message board and I saw someone post about the good ending, and I was like, oh my god, I have to get all the legendaries. I think actually, if I remember correctly, on my second playthrough, I did actually get all the legendaries, but I think I broke one of them by accident, and that's why I didn't get it, which is also really bad design in my opinion. So in a remake, should we change this? Should we change this? I actually think we should keep it in, but we should change it around a little bit. I think that in these days, everyone's on the internet and everyone talks with everyone, so secrets like that aren't really as convoluted as they used to be. So I don't really think there's anything wrong in keeping an ending like that, where you actually have to do stuff to unlock it. I think that honestly works. But there are a couple of things I would want to change about that in a remake. First of all, it should be a lot more clear to the player when there's a guidance chapter. They do drop small hints about it in the story, but you have to really be perceptive to notice it, at least on your first time around. So I wouldn't mind the game straight up telling you, hey, there's a guidance chapter after this, and if you don't unlock it, you don't get the good ending, so please try your best to unlock it. I wouldn't be sad if they did that. The second thing is, if you get a legendary weapon and you break it, it should still stay in your inventory as a broken legendary, and you should still get the good ending even if you accidentally break your sword. Because honestly, the way the legendaries work in FE6, I mean, they have 20 durability, and they're really strong, but if you accidentally break them, which can very easily happen if you, for example, you put the Apocalypse Tome on Sophia and you have her fight a bunch of enemies, she can very quickly break her tome by accident, which is really a bad design. So once you get a legendary, honestly, that should be it. You should be able to get the good ending as long as you unlock all the guidance, even if you accidentally break your legendaries. You could maybe improve the durability of them a little bit, but you have to be really careful about this. Project Ember did this as well, and again, they can very easily break the game if you have too many uses of them, so you gotta be very careful about this. But I actually think you should keep it in. You should keep the good ending in, but be more transparent about it to the player, and maybe not allow the legendaries to break as easily as they do. At least that's my 2 cents about it. So up next, I want to talk about the inclusion of some extra playable characters into a potential FE6 remake. I've already talked about the inclusion of FE7 characters, which I'm not a big fan of, but there are some characters which I would be okay with showing up. 3 that springs to mind are the manga exclusive characters, Al, Tiena, and Gaunt. These are characters that are not in the game, but they do have weapons named after them. And on a side note, the FE6 manga is really weird. It starts off with Al, who's like this side character, and you think that they did it that way because they didn't want to mess with FE6's plot, but then he kind of goes and gets involved with Roy anyway, and towards the end it kind of ends up being like weird fanfiction inserted into the canon plot, which is kind of weird. But yeah, I think this is honestly a really good opportunity to include them as DLC characters. I know we don't like DLC, but it's going to be in the game no matter what we do, so we might as well accept it. And honestly, I think if they're going to include extra bonus characters as DLC, this would be a perfect way to do it. Just give us Al, Tiena, and Gaunt. I think that would work, honestly. Echoes did something similar where they included some extra characters, and I'm okay with it. I think that a good way to get them into the game is that they could simply show up in the villages in which you get their weapons, right? In the village where you get the Gaunt's Lance, if you have the DLC, you get Gaunt with the Gaunt's Lance. Same thing with Al, you know, in the village where you get the Al sword, you get Al with the Al sword. And of course, you know, I'm not gonna lie, I'm very biased because Tiana is like one of the most gorgeous character designs in all of Fire Emblem, and I would definitely love to have her as a playable unit. Please give us Tiana. Yeah. Anyway, this would be a good way to do it, I think, personally. Another character that springs to mind that could be playable would be Princess Guinevere. She is available as a bonus character in the trial maps. She's actually the last character you unlock, and she's ridiculously busted. She is a sage with light magic rank, which, you know, in FE6 that's pretty unique. That didn't happen until FE8. But Guinevere can use light magic, and she's actually so strong. I think I did a calculation. She actually beats Sephiel in one-on-one combat if she's allowed to wield the Aurora. It's really hard to say this. I'll get this right. Aureola. I think that's how you say it. If she's allowed to wield the Aureola, she takes on Sephiel in a one-on-one battle, which is stupid. But again, she's not really supposed to be this strong in the game's plot. I think this is more like an Easter egg. I think you gotta beat the game like 10 times to get her or something crazy like that. So she's supposed to be a secret Easter egg character. And I always chose to believe that in the canonical plot of FE6, Guinevere is not this strong. This is just a bit of a reward for beating the game this many times. It's just a bit of like an haha, here you get a playable Guinevere, look how strong she is. Because if she's this strong in the game's plot, what's stopping her from just grabbing a lightning or a shine tome from the nearest vendor and just like killing her way through the soldiers? Like, Guinevere with those stats, she would not be in the need of Milady or Roy to rescue her. She could just kill Sephiel's army on her own. So I wouldn't necessarily mind her being playable, but I think her power level should be toned down. She could be kind of more similar to Elinsha when she shows up in Path of Radiance. She's kind of like a unique unit, she can heal and stuff, but she's not super strong in combat. And I think that would work for Guinevere as well. I wouldn't mind her being playable, but if she has her trial campaign stats, it's just gonna feel really stupid. It's like, I will fight alongside you, Roy. And Roy's like, you've been like just on the sidelines this whole time. You could have just like soloed the first 20 chapters with those stats. She's like, yeah, but I didn't want to because the violence is bad. Yeah, it would be kind of silly. But yeah, I would be okay with that. The three manga characters as DLC exclusive, and maybe a playable Guinevere in the late game. Alright, ladies and gentlemen, my name has been Mengs, and this has been what I want in a Fire Emblem 6 remake. Are there any other games you'd like me to talk about in the same fashion? Do you like me to talk about Tracia 776 or maybe one of the localized games like Fire Emblem 7 or Fire Emblem 8? I'd love to do it. Just let me know about it in the comment section below. And as always, if you guys have any input on what I just said, if there's something you agree with or if there's something you disagree with, I'd love to hear about it in the comment section below. I'd love to see you guys discussing and debating. I think I know most of the things you guys are going to talk about. In particular, Lyn as a playable character, I think is going to be probably one of the most debated topics in the comment section. But as always, guys, please let me know what you think. Click that like button, click that subscribe button, click the bell, all that good stuff. You know I love it. And I will see you guys very soon. Bye-bye.